Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Are You Ready to Garden? Tonight we'll be talking about container gardening, why garden off the ground. There are a lot of great farms in Middlesex County, and if you're looking for a farmer's market, you pick farms, nurseries, and more, you can visit this website. It's www.tinyurl.com/midcogrown. Strawberry season's coming up, so there's a lot of great farms that have you pick strawberries, or if you don't want to pick strawberries, that just grow strawberries and sell them at their farmers markets. It's a really great interactive website. You can see the map and all the locations, so I highly recommend this. You could also use the QR code with your phone and just snap that and it will bring you directly to the website. Are you interested in learning more about gardening? The Rutgers Master Gardener program will be starting up in person this fall. If you're interested in the program, please email us at mastergardeners@co.middlesex.nj.us, or you can call us at 732-398-5278. So tonight, Pat Donahue is going to be presenting about gardening off the ground, different methods of gardening that are not in the ground, but actually off the ground. So here is Pat Donahue. She is one of our master gardeners. She has her BS degree from Columbia and an MS degree from Rutgers, both in the sciences. And after a 15-year career in environmental protection, Pat became a science teacher. She recently retired after 22 years in the classroom, and Pat earned her Master Gardener certificate to properly manage the extensive gardens of her and her husband's historic home. Pat, you want to take it away?
Okay, welcome everybody. And the presentation is divided into three sections: raised beds, straw bale gardening, and containers, all of which occur off the ground. So we're going to start with raised beds. And what is a raised bed garden? Well, it's most commonly an enclosure of some sort that is higher than the surface, and it makes it much more convenient to grow either plants, vegetables, flowers, whatever. And it can be a really good alternative for people who cannot garden due to limited space, poor soil, inadequate drainage, which is my problem at my house, or if you personally have physical limitations. There are two main types of raised beds: formal beds and informal beds. Most of the ones at my house are informal, but I make them look a little bit more formal by ensuring that they have nice sharp edges, demarcation between the lawn and the bed. But most folks think of raised beds as something that it does in fact have a frame. There are a lot of advantages to raised bed gardening. You can build them almost anywhere. It's a good way to avoid poor or contaminated soil. While they can be pretty laborious to set up, once they're set up, they're actually very labor saving. You can control the soil quality better. You can improve soil drainage, and it's a lot less bending, and you can match the types of plants to the soil, and I'll be mentioning a little bit more about that later. So the first thing to consider is, where do you want to put your raised bed? And the number one criteria to consider is, how much sunlight are you getting? You need at least 6 hours of sunlight, but if you want to grow vegetables or fruit, you're going to need 8 to 10 hours. Also keep in mind that you should know where you're going to get your water from. Raised beds do have to be watered, and here at my house, I have several 100-foot hoses, and it's not a whole lot of fun to drag that length of hose around to water things. So where is your easiest access to water should help you decide where to put your raised bed. You should be looking for a flat or a level site. And what orientation toward the sun. The goal here is to avoid some plants from casting shadows or shading the others. So I'm going to show you this picture. It looks a little silly, but the person who set up these raised beds decided to take this orientation issue really to heart and put everything on an angle to maximize the ability of the plants in the beds to get the most sun. So this is rather a unique perspective. I guess it was from a drone. So once you've decided where you're putting it and how you're orienting it, you really need to think about what are you going to build it out of. So typically you're looking for a rot-resistant material of some sort. Now there are several types of wood that you can buy that claim to be rot-resistant, but you have to be really careful what you pick because some of them can have chemicals in them, preservatives that you don't want getting into your soil and then into your plants. Now an alternative, if you'd like to use wood, is to consider the plastic wood, like that Trex material. However, it has become really expensive. So the simplest, most straightforward raised bed that I could think of would cost maybe a little bit more than $50 now with the prices of lumber, but you would basically need 4 planks of wood, a little bit of rebar, and a mallet. And it would take you about an hour and you could build something that would look like this. Now you don't have to purchase planks of wood if you have hanging around either railroad ties or logs. Perhaps you've lost a tree in the last windstorm. These also make very nice frames or borders for a raised bed. Now, if you'd like, you can do something a bit more fancy or sophisticated. This, unless you know how to do brickwork yourself, you'd have to hire someone to create these nice brick raised beds and patio. The same goes for using stone. So here we have some raised flower beds done in stone. And notice how this was done on a hill, because I did start by saying that you want a level area. So these stones were used to create level stepped areas coming down this hill. You can also use steel. And the one caution I have with the use for metal is that it can get very hot and it can cook the roots of the plants. Now, typically, if you have a very large container like the ones pictured here, you won't have that problem. But certainly with a small pot, that would be of concern. Now, I'm not going to show this video because I'm not certain that the link will work, but you could easily search it on Facebook. And it is about a 2-minute video that shows you how to make your own free-form steel raised bed. I was surprised at how easy it is. And you can actually create any size or shape that you want. So if you have a small area where you really want a raised bed, maybe it's an odd shape, this may be a way to go. Now, continuing with this idea of using metal, these are actually troughs, animal troughs. I found them at my local tractor supply store. I'm sure they're available other places. And although they're metal, they're quite large, so they're not going to get overheated. And they're attractive, if this is attractive to you. I'm actually dying to try this. So you can use metal. You can also use cinder block. So it's a simple process of clearing the area in the shape that you want to build your raised bed, lining it with something. In this case, there's some wheat fabric there, but you can use cardboard or newspaper, other materials, filling it with soil. And in this particular case, you'll notice that they have taken additional stone and covered the tops of the cinder blocks. But you don't have to do that. In fact, you can actually put soil in the holes of the cinder blocks and plant in those holes as well. So on the right, you see that they've actually used regular cinder blocks and some fancier material and created this stepped garden out back. And this is all made from cinder blocks. And well, I don't know that I would do this, but I thought it was rather clever. You could even make yourself a seat to sit in your garden. And what I like about this picture is you'll notice that they've even put plants growing out sideways from the cinder blocks. And this works perfectly well. It is in fact possible. So those are your basic choices of materials. And now when you're ready to create your raised bed, there are a few things you need to consider. And one of the first is, how deep is it going to be? The minimum depth is 6 inches, but I would really recommend much closer to 10 and as much as 14 inches. This will require less watering. And in terms of width, the standard is about 3 feet. Now, if you want to go wider, keep in mind that you're going to have to be reaching over into the middle of the raised bed. So if you're going to 4 feet or more, you're now creating a little bit of an issue for yourself in terms of getting to the plants that are more in the middle of the bed. 6 to 8 feet long is pretty standard, and leaving space between the raised beds is a good idea because that gives you a place to work. Keep in mind, if you are trying to account for baby carriages or wheelchairs, that you'll want to leave the space between them considerably larger, perhaps 4 feet. Now, if you are doing small space gardening, you don't have to worry about these things. You're just creating your one raised bed and wherever your small space is. So you don't have to worry about how you're going to walk around it. And you certainly don't have to consider creating something quite this large. So now you need to fill it with soil. You've decided where to put it, what to build it from. You've set it up, and now you have to put your soil in. I'm also not going to click on the link there for a soil calculator. They're relatively easy to find online. And basically what you do is you measure the dimensions of your raised bed. You plug the numbers in, how high, how long, how wide, and it'll actually tell you how many cubic feet of soil you're going to need. Now, we do not advise that you dig up soil from your yard and put it in. That soil tends to be too heavy and it doesn't drain particularly well. So you should be using topsoil or garden store-bought soil and amending it with compost, manures, etc. I make my own soil. I take some sanitized topsoil and add peat moss, perlite, and vermiculite. I was quite pleased in the store the other day that they were selling large bags of soil particularly formulated for raised bed gardening. And I bought a couple of them because I just put in a new raised bed, and I was actually very pleased with it. It's actually very, very nice soil. Now, if you need to, if you're unsure of the soil that you have prepared, you might consider doing a soil test. You can contact Master Gardeners for the procedures. I know the state soil lab is open and working, and you can test your soil and send it in for analysis. This may be important if you're trying to create a specific type of environment. So for example, if you want to grow a plant like a blueberry that likes a low pH, you can have the soil tested to make sure that you're going to make your blueberries happy. You can consider saving yourself some trouble by installing trickle irrigation. And when you are complete with your plantings, to add mulch to the surface to reduce water loss. So here's a picture of a raised bed that has a trickle irrigation system. And these now come in kits where you can take the various plastic pieces so that you can make right angle turns. And then you can see in the back at the top, you can see that the hose kind of curves through the plants. and you can set up a little watering system for yourself. And I found this particular setup very clever. Instead of a rain barrel, this person shortened their downspout and sent it into their raised bed. And as if that wasn't clever enough, they created a small stoned area in the middle, because if you've ever seen water come out of a downspout, it can come out very forcefully. So the idea here is that the water hits these rocks, slows down, and is spread out all the way to the other end of the raised bed and then waters the plants. A new type of watering that I personally have not used and don't know all that much about, but it is an ancient tradition, is a cultural practice, I believe, that dates back to the American Indians, and it's called the Oya watering pot. It's a clay pot that you bury in your raised bed, and rather than water the entire bed, which sometimes you still have to do, you make sure that this container stays full of water. I have not tried this, but it looks fascinating to me. I don't need this sort of thing because my problem is that my property is too wet. So I wouldn't necessarily be looking for additional ways to help with the watering. But this may be a nice thing for someone to try instead of dragging hoses around. So now you've set up your raised bed, and depending on what you're going to grow, you might want to consider adding a trellis. If you're growing any kinds of plants, some beans, cucumbers that like to vine and spread, you can create a trellis. And depending on how you do it, you can even create an arched little path here where it might be nice to sit in the shade. And when your produce is ready, it hangs down right in front of you so that you can very easily pick it. So I thought this was a very nice way to create a trellis and a raised bed. Now, depending on what you're growing, you might also want to consider adding some sort of protection. This looks like someone made it themselves. Perhaps it's a kit, and it looks like it's made from window screen. Now, this is terrific if you're trying to keep pests off of your plants. However, if you require pollination, you can't leave this cover on because your pollinators are not going to be able to get into the flowers and pollinate your crop for you. So here's a setup. Somebody made this one raised bed, and it looks a lot fancier than it is. You'll notice that it's some basic planking, and they've used some plastic PVC pipe to create arches, and they've simply hung plastic sheeting, which is available inexpensively at a hardware store, that they can bungee cord up when they're not using it to cover the plants. And they've used some wire mesh for trellises inside. So supposing that you have a rather small area and you'd like to do something fancy but simple, a way of increasing the amount of space that you have is to plant in a mound or a spiral. And there are some plans online for how you do this. One in the lower right shows you which plants should be more toward the bottom or toward the top. And there are a variety of materials that you can use to do this. And if this is what the space, your space allows, if you only have, let's say, 4 square feet or 5 square feet, by creating this spiral, you actually have increased the amount of the area and the amount of planting that you can do. Now, when I first put this presentation together, I was asked to do it for a senior center, and they wanted some information about raised bed gardening for their seniors. So I had recommended some wheelchair accessible raised beds, like this one or this one, which has a handy holder for your tools. Some more sophisticated ones that have shelves that run around the edges. And this one, which at first I thought, gee, they really went to a lot of trouble to make it pretty. And it turns out that those knobs are handholds so that folks with a variety of disabilities can either pull themselves up or hold on. And they've actually gone to the next step of piping the water right out to the raised beds. Certainly, you don't have to do anything this fancy. For example, if you like those troughs that I showed you before, you could put them on the ground sufficiently spaced with just gravel in between so that it's easy for wheelchair or carriages to move through. And if you're at the other end where you really need to do more of your gardening standing up, consider putting your container or your raised bed up on blocks and planks to make it higher. So it can be versatile. And I also found that there are a number of accoutrements that make gardening easier. So even if you have a raised bed, you still may want some additional accessibility. And for Christmas, I got the bench that you see the woman in the red slacks sitting on, and I love it. It makes my life much easier, and it's reversible, so you can kneel on it and then help yourself up. There are also extensions for those with limited arm and hand mobility. And if you really want to keep things simple, you can take the pots that your plants came in, add some bamboo poles, shape it like a teepee, and very easily someone in a wheelchair could roll themselves inside and be able to garden from inside and reach all of the plants. All right, so now, when are you putting your plants in the ground, and what are you going to put? So some plants like the cool weather, and others do not. In New Jersey, the most important thing to consider is when to start planting. And I know the weather's been nice and we all want to get out there, but in New Jersey, our frost date, the date after which you can be assured that there won't be frost that will kill what you've just planted, is May 15th. Now, I know I'm going to cheat and I'm going to put my plants in on Mother's Day. Excuse me, and that's my Mother's Day plan, is to garden. So most plants like moderate soil temperatures. Some will germinate when it's cooler, others will not. And some plants, you put them in and you only get one growing season, whereas others you can harvest several times. So you need to decide what you're putting where and if you're going to do a second planting. The one thing to consider with raised beds is don't ever plant anything that gets too tall. If your surface is now, say, 2.5 feet off the ground, your plant is now that much taller than it would have been had it been planted in the ground. When you're deciding what to plant, consider companion planting. Some plants like to grow together and others do not like to grow together. And I'm going to take just a minute because I really like this Native American approach. They called the three plants, corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. And they would plant them together because they all helped one another. The corn provided the trellis for the beans. The beans provided additional nitrogen in the soil and improved it. And the squash, by spreading on the bottom and shading the ground, would cut down on weeds and would conserve moisture. That is just one example of plants that like to be together or grow well together. There are many others. Keep in mind that if you have plants that like the same conditions, that you might want to set aside a raised bed or a section of a raised bed and keep them together. So for example, a lot of the Mediterranean herbs like it a little bit hotter and a little bit drier. But whatever you're planting and wherever you're putting it, please remember to invite pollinators to your garden. You can add some pollinator-friendly plants and mix them in with your vegetable garden or your flower garden. And remember that your pollinators cannot get through your screens or other protection that you may have down, your row covers, etc. So make room for them or make time for them to be able to reach your flowers. So supposing you have just a little bit of space, you want to put everything in together, you can do something called square foot gardening. This happens to be a 4 foot by 4 foot square. So each square is 1 foot. And you could do a 3 by 3. And then you would have 9 squares and you could choose what 9 things you were going to grow. Now in some squares, if you have a larger plant that requires more space, you can only fit 1. But in other squares, you might be able to fit more than 1. And if you like this approach to raised bed gardening, why, you could do all of them as square foot gardening. And here we have not only many raised beds and many square feet, but they've added the trellises and access to water. So that's what I have on raised beds. And next, I'm going to introduce you to straw bale gardening. I'm not going to spend too much time in explaining how to set it up because you need to know a lot more than I'm going to be able to tell you in order to do this. But it is gardening above the ground, and it has a distinct advantage that when you're growing in a straw bale, you are not introducing any soil-borne diseases. It's very easy to weed. These are great for small spaces. You can go anywhere from just 1 straw bale to an entire garden made from straw bales. The bales are lightweight. You can even put them down in areas that are somewhat wet. And you can put your tropical bulbs in them. I have a lot of elephant ears that I plant each year. And at the end of the year, I have to dig them all up, clean them off, dry them, store them for the winter. And the digging part can be pretty hard. But if you put your tropical bulbs in a straw bale, you simply loosen the straw and you can pull your bulbs right out. So here we have a straw bale raised bed that is an entire garden. Now, there are some disadvantages. They can dry out, so you have to water them a bit more frequently. And you have to add additional fertilizer because all that the plants are growing in is the straw and the initial fertilizer and soil that you had used in order to set it up in the first place. Now, this is not a permanent installation. Your straw bales will last 1, perhaps 2 seasons. So if you're going to do this, you then have to consider what are you going to do with all of that used or leftover straw bale material when you can no longer use it to plant. You also cannot plant perennials in straw bales because the bales themselves don't last and the plants will last much longer. The trick to straw bale gardening is to make sure that you get the right type of bale. So I've listed here what is preferable and what is not preferable. And if I can, a quick little story, I once got a grant for an urban reforestation program, and our contractor was tasked with not only putting all the plants in and seeding the area, but then covering it with straw. It was on a little bit of a hill and we didn't want erosion. And unfortunately, the contractor used hay with the seed heads in it. And it basically ruined our entire project because we had hay growing everywhere where we were supposed to have this little urban reforestation occur. So I'd be careful about making sure what you're getting with your straw bale. So to set it up, you can do it right on concrete. If you're going to put it on soil or grass, you should have something underneath it. Pick a pattern for your bales. Make sure the narrow side is up and leave the twine around it to hold it together. If you're putting them on a slope, you have to go up and down, not across the slope, so that they don't all fall over. And this is where I'm not going to take time to really tell you how to condition the bales, but there is a process using water and liquid fertilizer that has to occur when you first get the bales in order to prepare them to receive plants. So what can you grow in a straw bale? Well, just about anything. We advise against top-heavy plants like corn or a running or vining plant because it will simply move from one straw bale to the next. But there is a great variety there of the kinds of plants that you can grow in a straw bale. And depending on what you want to grow, you can have room, say, for 2 squash plants in a straw bale, but a similarly sized straw bale could have 5 or more bean plants or lettuces. So the needs of the plant will then determine how many you can fit. So here's a picture. I believe these are tomato plants that have been placed into their straw bales. And if I can make a pitch here for labels, you'll see that each one of these plants has a label. I've run into problems, not me personally, but with my husband when I said, please, dear, go out and snip me a couple of pieces of whatever, and he doesn't know what that is and comes back with the wrong thing. So I have since learned that all of my plants are labeled, even if I know what they are. So as an example of how effective growing in a straw bale can be, you can see these 2 plants in their straw bale, and they are surrounded by similar plants that have not done as well in their pots as these have. And again, because I like running into items of curiosity, I thought this was particularly clever. This person put their straw bale in a shopping cart. And the great advantage of this is if you have a limited sun in one location, you simply wheel your garden to where the sun is going so that your plants can get the right amount of sun for the entire day.
Why don't we take a few questions?
Okay.
And I love that picture, by the way. That's so funny. So for the raised beds that use steel, do they need to be galvanized? Do you know?
I believe that is galvanized steel. I won't swear to it. The aluminum ones are aluminum. The problem with those is that you have to make sure you drill holes in the bottom.
Okay. And as far as cinder blocks go, have you heard anything about cinder blocks releasing toxins into the soil?
No, I have not. That's a good question. I thought cinder blocks were just basic cement, but then again, you don't know what someone maybe has put into their cement. But that has never, it is not something in all the reading and master gardening that I've done that I have come across.
Okay.
It's a very interesting question, though.
Yeah, I did read a little bit that they could leach lime, but that would really only raise the pH. Which,
yeah, that would only change your pH, so
right.
You'd have to be aware of that and adjust for it if you needed to.
Correct, and then that's where soil tests come in. So one of your slides say not to grow tomatoes with cucumbers. Now, would you recommend putting a tomato plant and a cucumber in different beds, or do you think planting them in the same bed would be okay?
I think the same bed is okay as long as they're at a distance from one another.
Right.
Now, I can't specify what that distance is. I doubt it's 6 inches. It's probably more like 2 or 3 feet.
Right. So as you know, as long as you're, because they both grow fairly large as far as, you know, density, because tomato plants are pretty thick, and then cucumbers usually vining, so it would be beneficial for both of them to have, you know, enough space for them to grow.
And their own space. And if you have a vining cucumber, you probably want it not vining up your tomato. You would rather it vine up a trellis. I will continue.
Thank you.
So next is container gardening. And this is something I think that we probably all do, even if we just do it inside with our houseplants. This poor person had no choice but to do container gardening because their lawn was a slab of concrete. So whoever this was, I just found this picture. I give them a lot of credit for trying to garden on a concrete slab. If that's what you've got, then container gardening is the way to go. So there are advantages of container gardening. You can start off weed-free. They're relatively inexpensive. You don't have to dig. You can choose where to put the containers. There are some disadvantages. They tend to be quite heavy. They need to be watered virtually every day, especially in the heat of a New Jersey summer. And you have to add fertilizer. The plants will exhaust the nutrients that you've provided in the limited amount of soil in the container, and so you will have to add food for them. And again, as before with the raised beds or the straw bales, you have to take into account how much sunlight you're getting, so that if you're trying to grow anything that is a fruiting crop, you're going to need more hours of sunlight, as opposed to if you're trying to grow something like a lettuce that can get away with less and likes to be a little bit cooler. So water every day. You're better off putting these on a very level or flat surface because the pots tend to be a bit top heavy and they will topple over. And draining water, because all of these containers should have drain holes. They can stain the concrete or your deck or whatever they're on. So I highly recommend that you put plates or dishes underneath them. And my second recommendation is that you put them on wheeled dollies. Now, I bought some at a local supply store, and they promptly broke. They lasted a season. So I went ahead and ordered online some very heavy duty dollies, and they can hold, I think, about 300 pounds. But I have enormous containers, and I know that they're quite heavy. I don't know that they're that heavy, and I've had those now for several years. And it helps because I can, in the winter, when I'm ready to put everything away, you can't leave your containers out because the freeze thaw may crack them. So I, using the wheelies, just wheel my large containers under the porch for the winter. So I highly recommend dollies for the larger containers. And again, you have a lot of choice about the types of containers that you can use, depending on the size that you need, how much money you have to spend. And here's that note about the metal containers. They can get quite hot. So I would personally not use anything smaller than the one pictured in the lower left. I think that has the potential to heat up the soil too much. And I included the picture in the lower right because, again, people can be so clever. This is a baby pool, a little wading pool, and somebody obviously is having great success in using that as a garden container. Now, one of the more recent additions to the gardening repertoire are these grow bags. They fold perfectly flat, or you can curl them up and put them away. Typically, they just have handles, as you can see, say the green one on the left, so that you can pick them up and move them if you need to move it into a sunnier location or get it out of your way because you're cleaning up. And then I saw these on the right that actually have a flap you can open so that you can see what's happening with your potatoes or your carrots. I have never tried these, so I can't speak to how they work, if there are any issues with them, but I have seen some blogs and presentations online, and people seem to like them. Now, as I said before, an issue with containers is that they have to be watered. And so also new on the market is this idea of a self-watering container. It consists of a storage chamber on the bottom or an overflow mechanism for the excess water. And there are online plans available where you can build an inexpensive one yourself. So for example, this is just a bucket with some cut pieces of rubber tubing and another piece of a little rubber pipe sticking out. And the round metal piece with the holes in it is actually an old-fashioned colander. I used to have one. I may still have one. And you can make your own. As I said before, there are plans online to build one on your own. And if you are handy or you want a challenge, this can help reduce the amount of watering that you'd have to do with your containers. But it doesn't mean that you'll never have to water them. You still do. A really important thing with containers is the depth. As with the raised beds, where I said that 10 to 14 inches of soil was preferable, with containers, you have to match the depth of the container to the type of plant you'll be able to grow in it. So here is a list of some examples. So if you're growing lettuce, you can get away with a more shallow container or pot. But if you're trying to grow, say, an eggplant or a patio tomato, you're going to need a much more sizable container to do that. And these are also available. You can get these guides that tell you if this is the plant you want to grow, what's the minimum size container you should get, and how many plants can you put in that container. So again, if you have something like a tomato plant, you're going to need a larger container and you'll only be able to plant one plant. Now, here's a trick that I learned at Master Gardening. You'll see in the lower left where it says that I got this from Virginia Cooperative Extension. Whenever, first of all, you should always go to Rutgers Extension to get your information. But if you're doing a search online and whatever you type in, say you're looking for information on how to grow eggplants, you type in how to grow eggplants extension. And that ensures that the information that is pulled up is going to be from a reputable source, typically a land-grant university in this case. This is from Virginia. Now, these don't have to be fancy. You can use plastic containers, some wood and tubing, and set up a perfectly acceptable melon garden. It may not be attractive, but it certainly gets the job done. So what do you put in? Again, please don't use soil from your garden. It's too heavy. You're introducing weeds, potentially diseases, and it doesn't drain well. So there are several lightweight soil-less mixtures that you can buy. ProMix just happens to be one of them. As I said before, I make my own soil, and now the good garden centers are actually carrying some specifically formulated different types of mixes. And I was impressed with what I saw at my local garden center. But in a container, in addition to water, you're going to have to be very cognizant of the fact that you need to fertilize. The soil is depleted more quickly when you're gardening on this small scale, and so you're going to have to add some organic material. You might want to consider what containers are being used for what, and rotate them from year to year unless you're replacing all of the soil every year. I do not replace my soil every year. I simply add to it, but this may be something that works for you. So what can you grow in a container? Well, you can grow just about anything in a container. Some plants are a bit more challenging. There are some that we recommend you not grow in a container. So for example, if you plant a cabbage or you plant broccoli, once you've harvested it, that's it, you're done. You've gotten your one harvest. You've used up at least 1 square foot of your space for that one plant. If that's okay with you, fine. But if you want, you should be planting things that continue to provide more foods like tomatoes or beans. When you're planting in containers, look for bush or dwarf varieties that don't get quite as big, but still produce the same amount of fruit or vegetable. You can even grow fruit trees in containers. There's a list of the ones that I know of that are available. And they will tell you in the garden stores, if you're buying these, that they can be advertised as self-pollinating. They might be, but it might not work all that well. And you're always better off to have at least 2 so that they can cross-pollinate. But as you see, those are some reasonably sized containers, and they're growing trees, fruit trees in them. Typically, you want to choose something with a very high yield so that you get a lot of bang for your buck. In the lower right, thank you, Angela, for introducing me to red noodle beans, because now I grow them every summer. I love them. And in a container, you can also add a trellis for anything like a bean that wants to vine. And of course, let's not forget that you can grow flowers in containers, and that there are a lot of different types of containers. Here's one at my house. I have an old cast iron tub, and this is from a couple of years ago when I decided to do all creams and yellows. Last year I did sunflowers. That was a big mistake because they got broken in a big wind. I also have an old sink that could not be repaired because it had completely non-standard openings. And so those are some flowering hens and chicks. So not only do you have a lot of options in containers, they can go everywhere. Every small space that has some sun is an opportunity for you to grow something. Look at your porches, your balconies, your windowsills, the edge of your driveway, around your mailbox. You can even hang garden boxes or containers from a sturdy fence, or use a fence as your trellis. Consider a design element with containers. Maybe you want to match all of them, have the same shape but different colors, or perhaps they all have the same color but they're different shapes, so that you can create not just the plants as decor, but the containers themselves as decor. And if having enough light is your problem, consider having containers you can move where the light is. So on the left are those storage boxes that you can get at just about any Kmart or Target. And on the right is a wheelbarrow. You simply pick up the handles and move it to where the sun is. Now, some folks like to cover their containers the way you might cover a raised bed. And I thought this was rather clever. Someone had used these cheap plastic umbrellas. This is fine to a certain extent, but again, remember your pollinators can't get in there. and it may get too warm and too wet. So if you're going to do this, you have to do it judiciously. And containers have to be managed a little bit more. You can mix flowers and vegetables and herbs in containers. You can group them together to help with water retention, but be careful because that also helps it spread disease. And if you have any kind of a disease and your containers are small enough that you can manage them, I have some that are so big, I don't know that I'll ever be able to do this. You should disinfect them, and a 10% bleach solution is the recommended method. And of course, if all of this is like, whoa, this is just too much for me, and money is no object, you can buy one of these. And all you have to do is get the plant. This is rather expensive, but it has all of the bells and whistles. It's self-watering, it has a cover, it is portable, you can move it, it's easy to fill, it's up high, so it's accessible, it's made of plastic, so it's durable, etc., etc. I think it kind of takes some of the fun out of it, but if this is all the space you have, then this is what you do. And then I would like to end with giving you the website for Cooperative Extension, and also to let you know that on the second and fourth Fridays of every month, myself and my good friend Esther man the helpline. So if you have a question and you'd like to ask me, you can reach me on the second and fourth Fridays of the month. That is the end.
That was great, Pat. So much information. Thank you. We had a question from Jennifer about drainage holes in a trough, an animal trough. How many would you suggest? Is there a spacing?
Now, if you're looking at those troughs, the really big troughs, I would imagine that you would have to have several running down the middle.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking maybe like 6 or 8 inches apart, especially for the larger ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and don't do what I did. We placed the containers where we wanted them. I filled them up with dirt, and then we realized they didn't have holes. And I'm still married, but my husband was not very happy about having to lay on the ground and tip these huge containers and drill holes in the bottom.
Oh boy.
Do it first.
So Pat, going back to that picture you showed with the downspout, I guess there is a concern about, some E. coli issues coming from the roof and going on to the vegetable garden. Do you have any maybe solutions for that, or do you think maybe the stone and the sand would filter that?
I think that provided that's done right, there would be some filtration. And of course, that's only going to be if you really have a lot of birds on your roof. I don't know that most people do. I know we do because we're actively attracting birds. Someone else at one point had asked me about, does anything come off of the tiles on the roof? And other than grit, I don't think so. So I have not heard of that as a problem. I know that you cannot drink the water in a rain barrel, and this is but that it's recommended that the water in a rain barrel be used to water your plants or wash your car. So I don't think this is a whole lot different than a rain barrel. You're skipping that step of holding the water in the barrel when you're using it for watering your plants anyway.
Yeah, I think it was recommended, I think maybe it was Brendan a couple weeks ago, was talking about putting a little bit of bleach in the rain barrel to kill any disease.
Yeah, and sometimes they recommend that you put in those mosquito tablets if you haven't completely sealed your rain barrel.
Right.
You have to be super, super careful with bleach because it'll kill anything.
So do you have any recommendations about perennials in pots? Are there some perennials that you can put in pots that would overwinter better than others?
Typically what happens is that they freeze. The soil freezes, the roots freeze, and there aren't a lot of plants that are going to survive that. I recently saw something online about planting hydrangeas in containers, and I don't know that I would do it. I think if you're going to put a perennial in a container, it needs to be able to go somewhere where it's going to be a little bit safer, not necessarily inside, but maybe you push it up against the south side wall of your house. And the bigger the container, the less likely damage to the plant. I have not personally done it.
I was just making the comment on the Q&A that things like lavender and rosemary would not do well because they're not as cold hardy.
Yeah, lavender in particular, if the container gets wet and you get a lot of freeze thaw, that will push the plants up and out of the container. And I had that in my raised beds with lavender because I have a wet property. And I actually lost about 2/3 to 3/4 of my lavender because I was learning the hard way.
Right.
And the ones I could save, I had to move to higher, drier ground. So that whole freeze thaw cycle, and I learned something today because I did not know about the idea of using a plant that could go to more zones.
Question from Sue, if you need to disinfect containers every year, can you still reuse the soil mix you had in the container the previous year?
Yes, but you have to add organic matter to it because it has gotten used up. It's been depleted.
Can you put some wood chips at the bottom of a large pot?
Yeah, but because they get so darn heavy. People have tried all kinds of things. They've tried water bottles with the caps on so that they don't get crushed, so that they take up space at the bottom. Anything that is more lightweight, you can try and stuff in the bottom of a really heavy container, assuming that what you're putting in there doesn't need all of that space for soil for its roots. Depends on how deeply rooted that particular plant is going to be.
Again, if anyone is interested in the Rutgers Master Gardener program for this fall, you can email us at mastergardeners@co.middlesex.nj.us or give us a call at 732-398-5278 and we will get back to you. Also, if you're looking for a local farmers market, any you pick farms and nurseries, you can scan the QR code here to see our interactive Middlesex County map and support local agriculture. You can also visit the website at tinyurl.com/midcogrown. We really appreciate all the support from our County Board of Commissioners. They support us through our Are You Ready to Garden series and with Cooperative Extension. And so thank you to our commissioners. Pat, thank you so much. We really appreciate all your knowledge with container gardening, and thank you for all your information this evening.
Stellar job, Pat. Stellar job.
Thank you, and thank you for teaching me.
Oh, we learn from each other.
Exactly.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.